Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today is historian and author Thomas Zimmer. He's coming to us from Germany. And you probably know his work that focuses on the recent history of American democracy. He writes the Democracy Americana Substack and hosts the Is This Democracy podcast. Thank you so much for being here, Thomas.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to talk about your most recent piece, The Right Wants a Reichstag Fire, and some of your other work about extremism, how extremism has taken over the right. But first, I was hoping to talk with you a little bit about your situation because for the past 5 years, you taught international history at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. But you made the decision this year to go back to Germany in part because of the political situation in America. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I say we, meaning my family, my wife, my two little kids, and I. We left DC in early June, and look. There's always kind of several reasons for that, right? Personal reasons, private reasons, but the political situation was definitely a big part of it. I kind of felt more and more that I had to choose between keep doing what I do, which is I talk and write publicly about American politics, and I write very critically about the Trump administration. And I think it became clear sometime in the spring that this administration simply does not think the First Amendment applies to non-citizens. I'm a German citizen. I was in the United States on a work visa, and people will remember that Marco Rubio came out in like late March and said something about, "Hey, if you cause a ruckus," I think that was the word he used. "If you cause a ruckus, you're out. Right? We're gonna revoke your visa and we're gonna throw you out." Um, and you see this again now when one of the first things that they did was the State Department said, "Oh, we're going to look into all these foreigners who are saying critical things about Charlie Kirk, and we're
Right.
going to throw them out." Right. So it became clear that the Trumpists simply don't think the First Amendment applies to people like me. And so I was increasingly confronted with a choice: either I keep doing what I do, and I at least potentially make myself a target, and my family a target, and by the way, I mean, that has also increased significantly since January. You get people being very mean to you online, obviously, but I also started getting something that I would classify more as threats rather than just people being mean, right? That also just increased. And then you have the government saying the First Amendment doesn't apply to you. And so I felt, okay, either I keep doing what I do and I become a target ever more, or I I just shut up and I do not intervene in the public discourse anymore, and I just, I don't know, accommodate and make, I don't know, look away. And that was not a choice I wanted to make. And so again, we as German citizens were
Hmm.
in the privileged, I would say, position to say we can make a third choice, which is we're going to leave the United States, go to Germany, and then I can keep doing what I do, which is talk and write about American politics. Obviously, that is just not a choice that the people who are most vulnerable to what the
Right.
Trumpists are doing can make. But we were in that privileged position to make that choice, and so we decided it's just not tenable for us anymore to stay in the United States and keep talking and writing publicly about politics, and so we left.
The irony is that so many people come to America because of our First Amendment. And, a lot of the countries that they come
Yeah,
from obviously don't have those kinds of protections over free speech. And I know in talking with so many people who work with immigrants that um, the this administration's policies have really impacted so many of the people that they serve. And um, I feel like beyond just um, the clampdown on freedom of people who have immigrated here, it really is such a black eye to what
yeah,
America is supposed to be internationally, because we've
yeah.
always supposed to be, we're supposed to be a beacon of freedom.
And it's a massive, it's self sabotage. It's like self destruction, right? I mean, if you just it, at least since the middle of the 20th century, like one of the biggest advantages that the United States had in sort of in the international comparison was that people from all over the world wanted to come, right? Students, researchers, like anyone, like wanted to come to the United States and bring all the creative energy, all the innovative power, all the like all that good stuff, right? And bring it all to the United States. This was one of the things that, ironically, made America great, right? What
Right.
made America great, that it was open for all these people from around the world wanting to go to the United States. And that's just going to change. I mean, that is just not, this administration is, it's a disastrous like provincialization. It's like self-sabotage of the United States, which is again purely from the perspective of, if you want this country to be great, right? This is the last thing you should be doing. It's terrible, and it's causing damage, lasting damage, I fear, because I mean, I can tell you, like, towards the end of our time in DC, I didn't know anyone, any international, any foreigner, neighbors, friends, colleagues who weren't actively looking to get out.
Really.
And that's just going to get worse and worse, and it's just self sabotage, and it's a disaster.
Right. And we're losing so many scientists and experts in their field
Yeah,
who have been doing such important work at universities or in the private sector.
yeah,
And so, the impact goes so far beyond just, ruining the lives of people, but really cuts at the core
yeah,
of so much of what makes America such a strong country and a
yeah,
strong economy. I actually was in DC with my family a couple weeks ago on a vacation, and the National Guard troops are out there with their, automatic weapons, and it's such a different scene because I've been to Washington so many times, but it casts a much different feeling in the city when you walk around. And personally, I did not feel any safer.
yeah.
With their presence, nor did I see them really doing anything. And I would imagine, that's just such a powerful symbol for the city that you left.
I mean, it's crazy. I mean, no one, armored vehicles in the streets, and people with, like, automatic rifles patrolling the streets, even if they're not doing anything, that just changes the feel of where you are.
Right.
That's just not what a peaceful democratic society is supposed to look like, right? And I think
Absolutely.
we all feel this at a kind of very sort of fundamental level. We feel that that's just not right, right? It's not right that there's an armored vehicle standing right there when you come out of Union Station, when you come into the train station and you walk out and there's an armored vehicle. You just feel that's just not right. Even if, I mean, you and I, right? We would not have been immediately we're not the target group of any of this, right? But even like, if even and I'm speaking as like people who white people who look like, okay, fair enough, we qualify as what the Trumpists think America is supposed
Hmm.
to look like, right? And so we're fine. But now imagine if even we think this isn't right, this doesn't make me feel right, right? Imagine what people who don't look like us, right, must feel when they
Right.
know, like, any minute I could be stopped, I could be, I don't know, arrested, at least questioned. It's terrible, but that is the intended consequence, right? The intended consequence is, to send that message to anyone who is not, quote unquote, real American in this sort of weird ethno nationalist understanding of the Trumpists. You are not welcome here anymore, and we will come after you. And we don't want you in the public square. We do not want you participating in the public square. That is the message that they're trying to send with this.
Absolutely. Um, I do want to talk about your latest piece. The right wants a Reichstag fire, and so I thought if we could just start at the beginning. For those of us who are a ways away from high school and college history,
Yes.
let's talk a little bit about the initial Reichstag fire during
Yes.
Nazi Germany.
Yeah. So this is late February 1933. So it's just about 4 weeks after the Nazis had come to power. And the German Reichstag it's the seat of the German parliament. It's a building, right? The seat of the German parliament. It was set on fire. And the Nazis used this as pretext to nullify civil liberties and conduct sort of mass arrests of political opponents. The Nazi propaganda said, look, this is a communist plot. This is the beginning of a
Right.
communist revolution. And we need to crack down on this, right? And so
And
they
actually, you can find that same propaganda on X today.
No, absolutely, 100%. I mean, that is the point when people on the right, like, this is not, I want to be clear, this is not me saying this situation is like the Reichstag situation in 1933. This is people on the right, relatively influential people on the right, online right, intellectuals on the right saying, oh, this is our Reichstag fire moment, right? And what they mean is, this is just like in 1933. We also now need to crack down on this supposed leftist revolution or whatever they claim is going on. And that's what they're claiming. And this is really, I mean, like the Reichstag fire, and then the next day the Nazis sort of, they just implemented the so-called Reichstag Fire decree, which is sort of sort of an emergency decree that abolished constitutional protections and civil liberties. This was a massive, massive step in the direction of sort of erecting a one-party dictatorship in
Right.
Germany, right? So they mass arrested political opponents, and then about a week later, Germany had an election coming up, and so that election was no longer free and fair, as you can imagine, because political opponents were already in jail. And so that is all very much a sort of a key moment in this sort of story of how the Nazis managed quite swiftly to turn what was left of the democratic Weimar Republic into a one-party dictatorship. And it's absolutely striking, right? Yet you see this kind of rhetoric on the right, where immediately after the murder of Charlie Kirk, they came out and said, "Oh, this is our Reichstag fire moment," which is, I mean, if you think through the analogies, it's absolutely bizarre because they're taking the side of the Nazis in this analogy, right? They are
Right.
saying, just like the Nazis cracked down, used this as pretext to crack down against, leftists, whatever. This is exactly what we now need in America, and you see that rhetoric on the right, which is, I mean, uh, I think is quite telling of how sort of aggressively authoritarian their sort of desires are, and their plans for what they want to implement.
And it's striking that this rhetoric started, just within hours of Charlie Kirk's murder
Yeah,
before a suspect was captured or we knew anything about it. And you had the president of the United States saying from the Resolute desk, we know that it was leftists. Leftists have been inciting violence in this country. We need to crack down. There are enemies without any of the facts at hand. And then once there was a suspect who was apprehended who does not fit that profile, this sort of propaganda has continued.
yeah,
As far as JD Vance, the vice president, went on Charlie Kirk's show, and he was saying this is not a time for unity. The leftists are our enemies,
yeah.
which is very striking because there's not even the correct pretense for this, and yet there's
Yeah.
still they still keep going.
Yeah, I mean, you saw this in the aftermath of when Trump was shot last year in July in Pennsylvania, right? That it also turned out that the shooter was not a leftist, right? And had very sort of muddled ideology and muddled motives, and that's often the case in these individual
Right.
cases, right? These people have very weird understanding of what's going on. But over time, like, you see them talk. When you hear them talk now, they will say, "Oh, just like when Trump was shot, the leftists." So in the sort of right wing mythology, it doesn't matter that it turned out that it was not a raging leftist. I mean, Stephen Miller is out there talking about, I think this is a more or less direct quote, like these vast networks of leftist domestic terrorism that he wants to go after, which is, yeah, it's completely bizarre. It's obviously completely detached from empirical reality. But they're not going after sort of empirics or facts, right? They have sort of I think we can call this kind of a higher, quote unquote, higher truth that they're after, and their higher
Mhm.
truth on the right is, there is a real America, quote unquote real America, and it is under siege. It is under threat from this sort of fundamentally anti-American left. And they mean left in a very broad sense. They count anyone who's not on board with Trumpism, and certainly the entire Democratic Party. And that's just dogma on the right. That is not to be questioned. That's just fact, right? That is sort of the fundamental, and anything else flows from that. So while I think it will probably be it will hamper their attempts to use this as a pretext if it turns out that, again, the person who killed Charlie Kirk was not in any sense sort of an identifiable leftist. That can hamper their attempts to use this as pretext. But overall, they don't care much. They will just go with Stephen Miller's "this is all just leftist domestic terrorism," because, again, that is sort of their quote unquote higher truth. And everything else flows from that assumption.
Right. And we have been seeing an uptick in political violence, and
Yeah.
certainly any political violence is, antithetical to what
Yeah.
American democracy, any democracy, is supposed to be. But as you've written, there's copious evidence that most of the political extremism, the violent political extremism, is coming from the right, and
Yes.
in America, but also, across the world. And I mean, we've had many reports on this. There was, the famous Homeland Security report during the Obama administration that ended up being suppressed. But we've seen this for years, and I have seen a lot of the coverage of Charlie Kirk's murder seems to ignore that fact or hand wave it away by saying, see, there's violence on both sides.
Yes.
We need to turn down the temperature. And obviously, we do need to turn down the temperature. Violence is not the answer, but it's hard to solve a problem if you don't diagnose it correctly.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think I can understand where these attempts to basically obscure the reality that you just described, which is just fact. I mean, political violence is on the rise in the United States, by the way, specifically over the past 10 years, probably
Which
not. Probably not completely coincidentally the time when Donald Trump rose to sort of prominence in American politics, and it's coming overwhelmingly from the right. I mean, those are just facts. No one serious is disputing that, right? Now, I think I can even understand why people think, this is not the time to talk about that. This is more like, both sides and come together in unity and all that. Because I think it comes, at least in some cases. In some cases, it's just sort of willfully ignorant. In some cases, I think it comes from a kind of, uh, I think, a good and noble and commendable instinct to say we need to just really draw the line here and really make sure that we get all on the same page with, like, not in any way sort of justifying political violence, right? And again, in a vacuum, that's completely correct. I 100% agree. The problem to me is just that I don't think, unless we grapple with what's actually going on in the United States and sort of who has contributed to this sort of increasingly violent, increasingly militant political culture, because that's what's going on here, right? There's a political culture that is serving as kind of fertile ground for these kinds of violent acts, right? And that's certainly the case. As long as we're not facing reality here, that this is no one has contributed more to this kind of political culture than the leaders of the right. That means the political leaders, the leaders of the Republican Party. That means sort of the right wing media ecosystem. And that includes people like Charlie Kirk, right? Who have talked about their leftist enemy as purely, again, an enemy and not a political opponent with whom you might disagree, but as a fundamentally illegitimate threat to the very existence of the nation. And they've sort of embraced this idea that anything, any measure, regardless of how extreme, is sort of justified in this fight against this sort of leftist enemy. And look, I always ask myself, if someone really believes this, right? I don't know if Charlie Kirk really believed this or if Stephen Miller really believes this. I think it's hard to tell what they really believe. Like when Stephen
Mhm.
Miller says vast domestic terrorist networks, Does he really believe this? It doesn't matter, right? I mean, he's causing damage by talking that
And
way.
he has the power to do this.
Yes, that's exactly right. But if you think about, again, people on the right who listen to this day in and day out, who listen to their political leaders tell them, hey, these leftists are coming for you. They're threatening you. They want to kill you, that sort of thing. Like, what is someone supposed to do with that? If you really believe this, right? If you listen to this the whole day and you really believe this, you're not going to sit there and think, I guess I'm going to have to go vote when the next election comes around. You probably at some point start thinking, someone has to do something about this, right?
Right.
And that's where I think that's where most of the responsibility for this lies. I mean, I will just say that there is just no equivalent on the quote unquote left to this, right? It's just not. I am not aware. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of anyone of note in the Democratic Party, anyone of importance on the institutionalized left who has condoned this violence in any way.
Hmm.
And rightfully so, right? They're all rejecting it, and rightfully so. And so it's just not the case that this is like both sides condoning violence. It's just not, that's just not true. And I think as long as we, again, as commendable as the impulse might be to just, again, unity and bring everyone together, I don't think that's going to get us anywhere as long as we don't face the reality of what's going on in the United States.
What are the potential consequences here of having the Trump administration basically declare war on this amorphous concept of the
Yeah.
left? What could we see happening?
I mean, to me, this is so dangerous because we're already in a situation where the regime, the government has sort of militarized the political conflict, right? I mean, we're already in a situation where they are deploying troops in the streets of American cities, which I know it's hard to remember, but like at the beginning of the year, that was more like a horror scenario somewhere in the back of our minds, and that's already reality. And I think
Mhm.
what makes this so dangerous is that they are itching for escalation, right? Because I think the Stephen Millers in this administration are convinced that this sort of escalation, even violent escalation, is necessary because it's the only way they will be able to, bring the enemy within. That's a term they use all the time.
Right,
Bring the enemy within to heal and sort of defeat the opposition, the political opposition, but also the widespread opposition in the American population. I think they believe that is just necessary anyway, and so they have been looking for pretext, right? They have been looking for justifications. I think that's a big part of why they are deploying troops in the first place. They want to create these situations where you
right,
have the armed agents of the states constantly being confronted with a population that doesn't want them in the streets.
right.
And so, sooner or later, you can see how that is just destined to explode, right? And I think,
Absolutely.
yes, and Stephen Miller is looking for those kinds of situations
Right.
to then kind of escalate, right? And I think that's what's so dangerous to me because clearly they want this as a pretext to escalate. And so I think we're already seeing a really extreme crackdown on free speech in the country, which I find very, very concerning, especially also because you have a lot of institutions, civic institutions, that are kind of preemptively going along with it, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you see sort
A
of the
lot of
Washington Post.
universities.
Yes. And the Washington Post firing a columnist for basically just quoting Charlie Kirk. And I think it's very dangerous because it will quickly lead to free speech just being vastly curtailed in this
Right.
country. And for some people, obviously more than for others. And I think they really want to sort of escalate this. How far will they get with this? I think it's
Hmm.
really important that we do not buy into this idea that they are somehow omnipotent and can do whatever they want. I mean, Trump being lawless does not make him omnipotent, right? And that is just
Right.
not. There is still a vast gulf between the authoritarian aspirations that these people clearly have and the reality of a pretty complex like modern society and a federal system where there is still politics isn't over, politics is continuing, and there's still a lot of sort of room to push back and not
Mhm.
give in. But that's why I'm so sort of dismayed and concerned when you see these civic institutions just going along with what clearly the Trumpists want to do, which is a pervasive crackdown on speech, on
Right.
anything that sort of they define as leftist.
I think there's such a big gulf right now between our institutions that seem to be folding to the Trump administration right and left, whether it's corporations or major universities or major media companies versus a population, in poll after poll, you've seen Trump is not popular. He's
Yeah,
down to 39%. He's underwater with the vast majority of groups and in most states. And even on what used to be his strongest issues like the economy and immigration. And a lot of dictators or wannabe dictators are fundamentally in weak positions, and that inspires them to want to crack down even further. But we're in this, period of time in America where we see our rights being curtailed, but we still do have a lot of freedoms at our
yeah,
disposal.
yeah,
We stood up at the No Kings protests, and that's
yeah,
why, as you're talking about with them looking for this pretext of violence, why so many leaders have preached how important it is for them to be nonviolent so
yeah,
it does not give them the excuse. Um, but, this seems to be a critical period to me where we still have free and fair elections so
yes.
far, which, by the way, Democrats have performed very well in. We still can stand up for for mass protests,
Yeah.
and it's kind of a use it or lose it moment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I often get asked, so is America still a democracy? Like over here in Germany, right? International media, they will keep asking, like, okay, what is this now? Is it a democracy? Is it a dictatorship? And the answer is, it's kind of neither right now. It's somewhere
Mhm.
in between, right? I think that's really important. This is not a kind of black or white kind of situation. It is a kind of a kind of hybrid, a kind of mixed regime right now. I don't think we can still call the United States right now a functioning a liberal democracy. That's just not where the country is anymore. But it's also not a fully realized autocracy or a fully realized dictatorship. And I think political science has, I think, a very helpful concept to describe this kind of hybrid situation. They call it competitive authoritarianism, which is, again,
Right.
a term that sort of captures you are somewhere in between, in this area between a functioning liberal democracy and a fully consolidated autocracy, right?
So we're
Because
we're
I
in
mean, look,
we're
yeah,
basically in purgatory right now, as Dante would say.
yeah, and I think, but it's important. I mean, just like you said, right? It is really important to remember there are still a lot of democratic elements in play, right? We still have an opposition party. We still have protests. We have civic institutions. We still have, an independent media, even though it sometimes doesn't act like it, but it still exists, right? Um, but I think that the danger, and I very much agree with you. This we seem to be kind of at least approaching a kind of tipping point situation, right? Because the question now is, where is this going? Is it the directionality is pretty clear. America is moving away from the democratic end of the spectrum, right? We're on this spectrum somewhere between democracy and autocracy, and America is clearly moving away from the democratic end of the spectrum. Like right now, the direction is bad, right? I'm very concerned about the direction, and so at some point, I think the key thing is that it gets more and more difficult to turn this back around, right?
Mhm.
The further you move away from the democratic end of the spectrum, the more difficult it gets to turn this thing around. And at some point, you reach a tipping point at which it is just very hard to see how you're supposed to turn it around again, right?
Right.
And that is why, again, I think people need to realize it's not over by any stretch of the imagination. We must not buy into sort of these projections of strength. The Trump is very much like to project strength and like, we're going to win, we're destined to win, and democracy is destined to like go down and be destroyed,
Right.
whatever. It's not true. There's nothing is determined, nothing is destined. And in many ways, you're absolutely right. Trump is not in a super strong position. He's not popular, right? But we have to accept, and we have to be honest with ourselves and grapple with the fact that there are some very concerning signs that they are able to kind of consolidate their sort of more and more authoritarian hold on at least certain areas of American life, and and
Yeah.
and you see you see these tech leaders go into the White House and sort of kiss the ring, right? And
Right.
that's just very, very concerning, because those kinds of things are signaling, okay, these people clearly have accepted that Trump is just the man, right? And that's
Hmm.
exactly what you don't want to see. What you want to see is American civic institution and civil society pushing back, right?
Right.
Because that has to be the hope, right? The hope has to be in a relatively stable, until recently, democratic system with civic institutions with vast resources at their disposal, right? There is enough of a potential to push back against these authoritarian desires. That has to be the hope. And I'm getting increasingly concerned that's just not what we're seeing.
Right. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of your other work where you break down American right wing extremism so well. And I I think that would be helpful and in backing up a little bit and about how we got here, because you make the point that um, today's Republican Party is vastly different than it was, a decade ago and several decades ago, where you have a party that's been taken over by
Yep.
illiberalism, a party that does not embrace pluralism at all. Whereas, certainly, uh, eh, you could never say that the party was perfect, but you would not have expected last week when Polish airspace was invaded by Russia, Poland being part of NATO, for the United States to say, we're too busy to deal with this.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Look, I mean, I think a good starting point is when Trump came down the golden escalator in like June 2015, right? I think
Hmm.
immediately you had sort of two competing narratives of what was going on. One said, "Oh, this is a complete aberration. This is a complete departure from the history of conservatism and from sort of the history of the Republican Party. It's a hostile takeover. It has nothing to do with what was previously going on." That was one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum was the idea that, no, this is actually what they always were. This is just a mask off kind of moment. This is what underneath the mask, this is what it's always been. And I think the truth, or the most, I shouldn't say truth, the most plausible interpretation lies somewhere in between those two narratives,
Right.
right? Um, I think, to me, it's most. I'm a historian by training, right? So, and I try to understand where's this. How does this sit in the sort of longer term context of the American right? And I try to think of it, the modern American right, meaning sort of the modern conservative movement, as it kind of came together in sometime between the 1930s and the 1950s. Like something came together that called itself modern conservatism, right?
Hmm.
I think it was always a kind of broad coalition that ranged from moderate republicanism all the way to a pretty extreme end of the spectrum, right?
Hmm.
I think the idea that these more extreme forces were somehow not part of that coalition until Trump came down the escalator, that is not
No,
plausible. I think
there was virtuerism,
that's right.
we right. There's a long tradition. It's
Yes.
just you saw more of the
Oh yeah.
elites try and at least shove that to the side.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think the key question, if we understand the right as this kind of broad coalition, the question then becomes, why is it that now clearly the more extreme, pretty extreme forces and voices are in charge? Because that's clearly what is the case, right?
Hmm.
And I think, by the way, Trump is, I think, mostly more a manifestation of that general trend of these more extreme voices sort of rising within the broader right wing coalition rather than the cause of it. Although, again, since he is in charge, he's now also certainly accelerating and sort of making it worse. There's no question about it. I think the key for me is. There was always if you listen to, if you read up on these more extreme kind of sort of explicitly anti-democratic people on the right. They
Mhm.
always said, we're not actually conservatives. They always thought of themselves as counter-revolutionaries because
Mm.
they were kind of convinced that there was a kind of leftist, quote unquote, leftist revolution going on in the United States, by
Mm.
which they mean civil rights and sort of the undermining of what they always thought of as a kind of natural, quote unquote, natural order of white male Christian dominance, right?
Right.
And they kind of always basically said since the 1950s, look, I mean, conservatism is fine as long as it is able to keep that leftist revolution, quote unquote, leftist revolution at bay. But
Mhm.
once it is no longer strong enough to keep that at bay, we're going to go to something different that is no longer conservative. And I think that is precisely what's happened on the right. You now see
Yeah.
these people, they don't call themselves conservatives anymore. I mean, the very idea that conservatism is no longer enough, that
Mhm.
has become sort of the battle cry, the rallying cry on these sort of forces that have united behind Trump, because their perception is that the country has moved so far away from this sort of white Christian patriarchal order that they think is real America, right? That
Right.
there's nothing left to conserve and preserve. And so what you need now, and you see this sort of pervasively in, again, these sort of, if you listen to these right-wing intellectuals and these right-wing pundits, they will all tell you what you need now is not conservatism, is it's a comprehensive counter-revolution, right? So
Mhm.
something, a much more radical form of politics has taken over on the right. And that obviously has sort of elevated these much more extreme people and figures that, again, they were always there, and some of them were always
Mhm.
influential on the right. So in that sense, this is not a complete aberration. I don't think it makes sense to say, oh my God, Trump has nothing to do with anything that's happened before. That's not how it is. But there's a significant shift towards that more extreme end of the spectrum, because they are really convinced, and they really believe this, that, again, conservatism is just no longer an adequate response to a situation where they believe the left, very broadly defined, has taken over American life. And what you need now is a counter revolution. And so they speak of themselves as counter revolutionaries.
Right. And it seems like the blueprint for what they envision is Project 2025, which was written by the Heritage Foundation, which is called a conservative group. But I mean, there's nothing fundamentally classically conservative about that document. It's all about the restoration of, this white male Christian society that they want us all to live under. Uh, I believe you've made this point that it seems like a real watershed moment in the Republican Party in the American right was the election of Barack Obama in 2008, because that really seemed to shatter so many of their perceptions about how things were supposed to work in this country, and it kind of put this idea out there that things had gone radically off kilter and we needed a huge course correction. And
Yeah.
that seemed to be is symbolized eventually by Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you never want to say this is the one moment, right? There are
Right.
several of
Right.
those sort of escalating, but you cannot understand what's been happening on the right, and you cannot sort of tell that story without really focusing on that moment where I think the reaction on in some parts of the right really was this sort of complete sense of shock. Obama sort of
Mm.
symbolized, even though, I mean, look, if we're being honest, Obama was a fairly moderate sort of center
Yes,
liberal
absolutely.
politician, right? But
So a
what
lot
he
of this
stood
is about identity.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, so we're not talking about like the actual Barack Obama and what he was actually doing, but we're
Right.
talking about what he symbolized in these sort of quarters, in these sort of right-wing spheres, where, again, they saw this as proof, as sort of irrefutable proof that this was no longer, quote unquote, real America, right? That these sort of leftist extremist forces had taken over somehow. And I mean, this is really the moment when this sort of general, this sort of constant talk about revolution. I mean, the Tea Party, again, talking about revolution, Second American Revolution, all this sort of,
Hmm.
where they really switched the register from not talking like conservatives anymore and talking about revolution all the time, right? And you really, I mean, again, you cannot. It's impossible to overestimate how important that was. I will say one other moment that is sort of very much in line with this was the summer of 2020. So the mass mobilization in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, so these sort of broad, very broad sort of anti-racist sort of police violence protests in the summer of 2020, that was another moment when you really see a lot of these people on the right, I mean, frankly, completely losing their minds, right?
Yeah.
And really sort of viewing this, understanding this as, again, this is the moment when the left, broadly speaking, is has gone sort of has started their assault on America. And what are we supposed to do now? We cannot be conservatives in the face of this, right? And I think J.D. Vance, for instance, is someone who has very explicitly said that this was the moment when he realized is how we would say that, this sort of conservatism was just not an adequate response to this anymore. So you have a lot of these figures on the right that are sort of in charge of the government right now, unfortunately, who will point to this as another moment that really radicalized them.
Yeah. It seems to me that the Republican Party, in the 80s, 90s, and, most of, the early aughts, was very elite driven. And in general, the biggest principle was fiscal conservatism, low taxes, and, it was very driven by a corporate agenda. And one thing that seems to have flipped so much is that what Trump discovered is that the animating principle for people isn't low taxes for corporations. It's, he found a ripe target in particular with immigrants, but he's done this with so many groups, with trans people, and with people of color, and so on and so forth. But really identifying enemies to go after, and attacking this pluralistic nation that we have. And that seems to be a much more powerful force, at least for the grassroots of the right. And that seems to be a fundamental change to me. And I'm curious about your perspective, because obviously you're an expert.
No, I mean, I think I think I broadly very much agree with this. You see in the 90s a really key moment after the end of the Cold War when a much more sort of populist oriented sort of part of the right wing spectrum, when they come out and say, look, Cold War is now over. We can
Mhm.
dispense with all these niceties about defending democracy and whatever. We can
Mhm.
now turn our sights to what is the real enemy, which is liberal democracy, right? And you had
Mhm.
sort of an early version of this with the rise of Pat Buchanan in the early 90s. So Pat Buchanan, these people called themselves paleoconservatives
Right,
in the
right.
early 90s, right? So again, these are very much influential people in the Republican Party, but they are not in charge. They're very much not
No.
in charge of the Republican Party, and they know this, and they think the end of the Cold War is kind of an opening for them to
Mhm.
kind of push a much more openly anti-democratic, much more populist, and sort of much more ethno-nationalist kind of
Mhm.
idea of what the Republican Party should be and what the right should be. And Buchanan was sort of an early champion of this, and he challenged George H.W. Bush in the 1992 Republican primaries. He didn't succeed, but he came pretty close. He was very successful, right? And this was sort of an early indication that, oh wow, these forces, again, these sort of openly ethno-nationalist, aggressively anti-democratic, very much populist in their at least rhetoric, right? These forces are pretty strong actually within the Republican Party, and this was the moment when I think the Republican establishment and sort of the Republican elites, the more established elites in the Republican Party, made a very dangerous choice because I think they decided to kind of go along with this to a certain extent and kind of try to harness these more populist, more extreme energies that someone like Buchanan kind
Right,
of, I think, embodied. And they thought they could control this and they thought they
right,
could ride that tiger. And it has never worked.
right.
It has only ever happened to every sort of incoming a class of Republican Congress people being more extreme than the one before, and it
Right.
has only ever led to more extreme people being elevated within the party. And I think that is sort of the general dynamic that we see over and over again. Like these, and the last time we saw it was with sort of someone like Mike Pence, right, in 2016, or sort of. Mike Pence, who already when he came in was more a kind of, but not moderate, certainly kind of figure, right? But
No,
it was.
a huge social conservative.
Yes, yes. But he represented the more establishment kind of part of the
Right.
party against this more populist kind of wing that Trump represented. And once again, they kind of thought we can ride the Trump tiger. Trump can help us mobilize the base, right?
Right.
Which is a problem that sort of right wing intellectuals have been sort of grappling with for decades. How can we mobilize the base? Because the base doesn't want any of this fiscal conservatism, right? Or
Right.
that's at least not what they're sort of energized by. And so they thought, hey, how about we do what we have been doing for decades? We try to ride this populist tiger and then we get what we want. And what's actually happened is that they're being swept aside by these more populist, much more extreme energies. So that is a dynamic that you've seen for decades. And I think a dynamic that you absolutely sort of nailed in what you said. And it's really, I think, if we're thinking about key moments, we already had sort of the summer of 2020, we had the election of Barack Obama. I really think sort of that early 90s post Cold War moment when these sort of explicitly ethno nationalist, populist, much more anti democratic forces and
Yeah.
ideas, when those rose to prominence to a completely different degree in the Republican Party for the first time, again, embodied by Pat Buchanan, that is another one of those moments where you can
Right.
now, where we can now in hindsight point to and say, yeah, that seems to have been a kind of really key moment in this trajectory that ultimately leads to Trump.
Right. And it was during that period that's not too long after that David Duke, was the Republican nominee for governor, who was the Grand Wizard of the KKK. And
Yeah,
again, there was from most of the elites in the Republican Party, there was condemnation, but he wasn't running for city council. He was running for governor.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
and that's extraordinary.
He was running for Senate too in Louisiana, and
Right,
almost he in both these cases when he ran for Senate and governor, he got the majority of the white vote in Louisiana, right?
right.
And I think someone like Pat Buchanan very explicitly, and sort of the right wing intellectuals around Buchanan, right? So these people who call themselves paleoconservatives, which is they hated the neoconservatives, right?
Yes. Right, the
With
neocons because they
right.
they wanted to intervene all over the world, and there was definitely an isolationist streak.
Yes, absolutely. It's also part of the reason is also because a lot of the prominent neoconservatives were Jewish Americans.
Right,
And like, look, let's
absolutely.
face it, amongst these paleocons, there's a very strong anti-Semitic streak, always has
Yeah,
been. And that was also part of it. So they called themselves paleoconservatives, and they looked at David Duke not with horror and consternation. They said, "He's got something. That's
mhm,
fantastic. We can emulate this, and we can channel this, and this is the way forward for us." And that's precisely what someone like Pat Buchanan then tries to channel in 1992. Again, the circumstances weren't quite there yet for him to succeed in
right,
this kind of way within the Republican Party. But I think very clearly this is a kind of a proto-Trump sort of moment or proto-Trumpist moment when we think back now, and you see this kind of this sort of offer. Trump is offering something that Buchanan also tried to offer. This sort of mixture of ethno-nationalism, populism, anti-democratic energies, and a lot of grievance on top of it. Um,
right.
and Trump succeeded with that. Where again, Buchanan was a little early with it and didn't quite succeed yet.
And didn't quite have his charisma.
That is, you know what? That is a massive part of it. Like you have Trump offered kind of a package, right? He
Mhm,
packaged this with a kind of charismatic. I don't mean this in a positive
right,
sense, but charismatic in the sense that there is no question that the base, the Trumpist base, is personally loyal to Donald Trump. There's just
yes,
no question that that's the case. And the reason why Trump has dominated the Republican Party for a decade now is that absolutely no one else has this, right? No one
right,
else has this connection with the base. That is Trump's number one I'm going to say trump card, even though I mean my apologies. Um, but that's again, that is the one thing that no one else can emulate. He has this
Right.
personal connection to a personally loyal base, and as long as that is the case, I don't see how anyone can challenge him in the Republican Party.
Right. I mean, nobody else's face is plastered over flags and T-shirts and everything
No.
else, which is sort of bizarre in the American tradition, a country where we were founded to have no kings. You saw a bit of a cult of personality with Obama, that's true, but it was more of like his symbol, was everywhere. With Trump, it's very much his face,
Yep.
and that is the face of the Republican Party. And after Trump, uh, I'm not sure what comes next because nobody else has been able to cultivate that cult of personality like he has.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think the key thing is exactly what you said. We don't know. What we really don't know. There's no. I wouldn't believe anyone who's making sort of strong, confident predictions here. I guess there's two ways to look at this. One way to look at it would be to say, if it is the case that so much of this is about Trump and his personal connection with the base, then maybe once he's gone, um, maybe there's an opening for something that is less extreme to kind of,
Hmm.
compete at least with these more extreme forces. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that unfortunately, like these more extreme forces have so comprehensively taken over the institutions of the American right. They control the infrastructure of the American right so completely right now that it's really hard to see where that more moderate influence is supposed to come from. And you have someone like JD Vance who clearly lacks the charisma and lacks of the
Right.
personal connection, but he's not any less extreme than Trump. I
No.
mean, he traffics in, if anything, he traffics in these really, really extreme circles. He has some very strong connections with they it's like openly extremist, even neo Nazis with online scene. That's very concerning. And so, I mean, I think the question like, oh, would Vance be more or less dangerous? I think that's the wrong question to ask. Like, because like,
Hmm.
what does that mean, more or less dangerous? The key thing to understand for us, I think, generally right now, is to say we are in a profoundly uncertain situation where the range of possible outcomes from here is extremely wide, and I think that is generally speaking already telling you how dangerous this situation is, because in a stable democracy, right, in a stable democracy, the range of plausible outcomes should be very narrow. We
Right.
should all know that, well, whatever comes next, it will be a democracy, right?
Right.
um
One party wins. There's a peaceful transition of power. That's
yes.
that's how it all used to be before 2020.
Right, and that is clearly not the situation
Right.
anymore. I think the plausible outcomes, not determined. Not I'm not even going to say like I'm not guaranteeing anything. I'm not predicting anything. I'm just saying the plausible outcomes now definitely include a full-blown authoritarian takeover, and a complete democratic breakdown. And I think that is what we have to grapple with. There is now a realistic scenario to a very, very dark place. And again, it's going to get more and more difficult to turn this around, which is why it is so important to push back now. Whoever can push back and wherever we can push back, and especially sort of tell the leaders of our civic institutions to push back and tell our political leaders to push back. That is so important because it's never going to be easier to push back than it is today.
Right.
Tomorrow is already more difficult. Next week is going to be more difficult. So that's really now.
That's a very important message, and I appreciate you taking so much of your time to talk with us. I could talk with you for hours more, frankly. I love history. That was my major, and you are is so incredibly knowledgeable. So, thank you for taking so much of your time to be with us. I know it's evening where you're at, but I certainly hope that you'll come back and talk with us again.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you so much. I mean, I think I'll enjoy is maybe not the right word. I'd much prefer we could talk about something more pleasant, but I think it is important to have these conversations, and I very much appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for everyone for joining us.
Thank you.